When war broke out in the Pacific, the single-engine fighter units of the Japanese Army Air Force were mostly equipped with obsolete aircraft. Their primary fighter at the time was the Nakajima Ki-87, better known to the Allies by its reporting name, Nate. At the same time, the brand-new Nakajima Ki-43 fighter, nicknamed Oscar, was just beginning to enter service with a few air regiments. Despite a slow start, this aircraft eventually became the true backbone of the Japanese fighter force. It held that position for the next 3 years of the grueling war. In 1941, the powerful, purpose-built Nakajima Ki-84 Interceptor joined the ranks. This was a plane the Allies dubbed Tojo. 18 months later, the Ki-61 took to the skies, known to the Allies as Tony. This aircraft was unique. It was the only Japanese fighter with a liquid-cooled engine to enter mass production and see combat. Meanwhile, long after major combat operations began, rear echelon units were still flying the completely obsolete Kawasaki Ki-10 biplane. This plane was given the reporting name Perry. By the spring of 1944, the air war had drastically changed. Allied air forces had gained absolute air superiority across practically all fronts in the Pacific theater. The Japanese Oscars, Tojos, and Tonys simply could not go toe-to-toe with the enemy's newest aircraft anymore. American and British fighters operated with absolute technical and numerical superiority throughout the region. These included planes like the P-38, P-51, F-4U Corsair, F-6F Hellcat, and the Spitfire Mark 8. Japanese naval aviation at the time relied almost exclusively on various variants of its primary fighter. This was the Mitsubishi A-6M, which received the official reporting name Zeke, though it went down in history as the Zero. However, at this late stage of the war, the aircraft's biggest flaw became glaringly obvious. It had a critical vulnerability in dogfights against the newest Western fighters. This turned into an absolute disaster for Japanese pilots. Desperate to win back control of the skies, the Japanese Army and Navy chose completely different approaches. The Navy stuck to a conservative strategy, trying to endlessly upgrade their existing airframes. The Army Air Force, on the other hand, made a risky but ambitious bet on designing and producing entirely new aircraft. This move ultimately paid off when a completely new, incredibly formidable fighter, the Nakajima Ki-84 Hayate, entered service. In August 1944, American pilots of the 14th Air Force suddenly encountered a completely new fighter in the skies over China. Its performance far exceeded the capabilities of any Japanese aircraft previously thrown into combat. What's more, the aircraft proved to be a match for, and in some ways superior to, many of its American counterparts at the time. These formidable aircraft were Hayates. They belonged to the elite 22nd Squadron, based out of Hankou. The unit was formed in Japan in late March 1944. It was the first combat group to be fully equipped with the brand new Hayate Army fighter, which translates from Japanese as Gale. The core of the unit was made up of veteran pilots from an experimental test squadron. They had been brought together in the fall of 1943 to conduct operational trials of the new Ki-84. The rest of the aviators were carefully handpicked for this elite group based on their extensive combat experience. After 4 months of intensive training back home, the squadron, commanded by Major Iwahashi, was deployed to China. There, the unit instantly validated the High Command's decision. And even though there were never more than 30 of these airframes operational at any one time, they significantly helped the Japanese renew their offensive. However, the squadron's combat tour over China lasted only 5 weeks. They were urgently recalled to Japan via the Philippines. An imminent Allied invasion posed a critical threat to the Japanese Empire. After Japan suffered a bitter defeat in the Philippines, the squadron was pulled back to the home islands. They flew combat missions over Korea right up until the end of the war. The story behind this advanced fighter began when the highly successful German liquid-cooled Daimler-Benz DB601A engine was acquired by Japanese aircraft manufacturers. Nakajima immediately put together a new design team led by Tomio Koyama. Their main goal was to create a fighter that could compete with Kawasaki's Ki-61. They planned to power the new design with the Kawasaki Ha-40 engine. It produced 1,175 horsepower, Essentially, this was a Japanese license-built version of the German DB601. It was adapted for local manufacturing. Development of this aircraft was given the military designation Ki-62. It progressed along with a slightly modified Ki-63 variant. This variant was powered by a 14-cylinder Mitsubishi Ha-102 radial engine. Their development took up most of 1941. Ultimately, the military abandoned both projects before completion. They opted for Kawasaki's Ki-61 instead. That company had far more experience with liquid-cooled engines. Beyond that, Nakajima's engineers were already fully tied up with other major projects. These were the Ki-43 Hayabusa and the Ki-44 Shoki. But the invaluable experience Tomio Koyama's team gained didn't go to waste. Just 3 weeks after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Army Command approached Nakajima to design a replacement for their own Ki-43 fighter. This new project was envisioned as a versatile, long-range, multi-role fighter. It was expected to outperform the best Western aircraft known to Japanese intelligence at the time. The Army's maneuverability requirements were slightly relaxed compared to the Ki-43. However, they still far exceeded the performance of the Ki-44 Interceptor. This was because the new aircraft was primarily designed for air-to-air combat against enemy fighters. Design specifications called for a top speed between 398 and 426 miles per hour. This speed was required at an altitude of around 16,000 feet. Additionally, the fighter needed enough endurance to operate in combat for an hour and a half. This had to be achievable at a combat radius of 250 miles from its base. Power was to be provided by Nakajima's brand new 18-cylinder Ha-45 radial engine. The proposed armament was formidable. It featured two 12.7mm Ho-103 machine guns and two 20mm Ho-5 cannons. Crucially, the military also made pilot armor and self-sealing fuel tanks an absolute requirement. Drawing heavily on successful design elements from the earlier Ki-62 project, Tomio Koyama and his team began development of the Ki-84. This started in early 1942. Work was soon in full swing at the Nakajima plant in Ota, Gunma Prefecture. Thanks to the experience gained over the previous year, development moved incredibly fast. In early 1943, shrouded in absolute secrecy, the first prototype rolled out. It made its maiden flight from Ojima Airfield the following month. A second test airframe joined the rigorous flight test program in August of that same year. Both of these aircraft were powered by 1,800 horsepower Nakajima Ha-45 Model 11 engines. Externally, they featured a few interesting details. They had a large exhaust manifold on each side of the engine cowling. They also had a centerline drop tank that could be jettisoned in flight. Finally, the protruding barrels of two machine guns were mounted directly above the engine. Flight testing of the new aircraft progressed quickly and smoothly. The designers managed to avoid the typical teething troubles that so often plague new aircraft during development. Japanese Army Air Force test pilots at Tachikawa Air Base welcomed the new fighter with immense enthusiasm. Soon, 83 additional aircraft from the first service trial batch joined the original two prototypes. These were built at the Ota plant between August 1943 and March 1944. Most of these aircraft had only minor differences between them. Over time, however, engineers began introducing more significant modifications. For example, they refined the fuselage design to make future mass production as simple and cost-effective as possible. In addition, they had to reshape and increase the surface area of the tail section, specifically the vertical stabilizer and rudder. This was done to improve handling during takeoff. Heavy propeller torque pulled the aircraft hard to one side. During flight testing, the fighter reached a top speed of 388 miles per hour. Even though this fell slightly short of the military's original requirements, it was still faster than any other Japanese fighter ready for immediate production. Several aircraft from this first batch were handed over to a special experimental squadron. Crewed by veteran pilots, they put these aircraft through intense testing in the skies over Japan starting in October 1943. As an experiment, a few aircraft were fitted with ski landing gear for harsh winter conditions. The design was well thought out. The struts retracted into the standard wheel wells, while the skis fit completely flush against the underside of the wings. These unusual variants were tested on the northern island of Hokkaido from December 1943 to February 1944. However, the skis came with a few drawbacks. They increased the fighter's overall weight. This predictably reduced maneuverability and dropped the top speed by about 8 miles per hour. After completing these extensive evaluations, the fighter was officially accepted into service. Nakajima then rolled out mass production at its factory. That aircraft was the Ki-84 Hayate. But before ramping the assembly line up to full capacity, the military demanded a second pre-production batch for additional field testing. This batch consisted of 42 aircraft built between March and June 1944. In fact, they were built right alongside the first true production fighters. Those started rolling off the assembly lines as early as April of that year. The fighters from this second batch were almost identical to the final production models. One of the main upgrades was the introduction of individual exhaust stacks. This simple solution optimized engine performance and provided a slight exhaust thrust boost. It added roughly 9 to 10 miles per hour to the top speed. They also began using 2 additional drop tanks slung under the wings, just outboard of the landing gear struts. If needed during a dogfight, pilots could easily jettison them in flight. Underwing hardpoints were also installed on some aircraft from the very first test batch. Back then, however, they were strictly used to carry 550-pound bombs. A few fighters from the second batch were also fitted with longer span wings and a larger overall surface area. These essentially served as flying testbeds. They helped develop technologies for future, even more advanced variants, specifically the Ki-84N and Ki-84P. The production Ki-84 fighters, just like the pre-production models before them, were powered by the mighty Ha-45 series engines. Depending on the variant, these power plants produced anywhere from 1,800 to 1,990 horsepower. Full-scale production of the new aircraft ramped up in the spring of 1944 at Nakajima plants in Japan. Factories in Manchuria joined the effort shortly after. At the time, the Japanese Empire desperately needed advanced fighters to counter General Douglas MacArthur's return to the Philippines. Because of this, most of the first production Ki-84s were sent straight to the front lines on Leyte Island, equipping dozens of fighter squadrons. In actual air combat, the aircraft, officially named the Hayate, proved to be an incredibly formidable opponent. This was especially true with an experienced pilot at the controls. It boasted heavy armament, unprecedented armor for a Japanese fighter, and outstanding overall flight characteristics. The Ki-84 outperformed most Allied aircraft in climb rate and maneuverability. At low and medium altitudes, it easily held its own against the P-51D and P-47D. It outclassed almost everything else in the sky. Fortunately for the Americans and their allies, the average Japanese assembly line worker lacked the expertise of the highly skilled specialists who built the prototypes. As a result, production Ki-84s were plagued by manufacturing defects. Fuel and hydraulic systems constantly failed, landing gear struts snapped, and the Ha-45 engines rarely delivered their maximum rated power. To make matters worse, the overall training level of Japanese pilots and ground crews was steadily declining. This severely crippled the combat readiness of the Japanese Army Air Force. As soon as the Ki-84 began appearing in the skies in large numbers, Allied intelligence assigned it the reporting name Frank. Interestingly, this name was originally reserved for a completely different hypothetical aircraft. This was the TK-4, which was rumored to be under secret development in Japan. When the mythical TK-4 never materialized, the head of the intelligence team, Colonel Frank McCoy, decided to give his own name to this dangerous new Japanese adversary. Even though combat pilots welcomed the arrival of the Hayate with great enthusiasm, Nakajima engineers had to urgently work out the aircraft's bugs. They scrambled to fix the numerous defects that had cropped up during the heavy fighting in the Philippines. Right from the design phase, Nakajima had placed a heavy emphasis on ease of mass production. This partially paid off. Manufacturing the Ki-84 required about 40% less tooling compared to the earlier Ki-43 and Ki-44 fighters. However, even this significant simplification in design couldn't make up for the overall drop in build quality. Experienced workers were being drafted to the front lines in huge numbers. Meanwhile, the Japanese Ministry of Munitions demanded impossible production rates. This pushed the factories to their breaking point. As a result, production Hayates could rarely match the stellar performance numbers of the early prototypes. Out in the brutal conditions at the front, the aircraft often proved to be temperamental and highly unreliable. In an attempt to boost the fighter's reliability and combat power, they started equipping the Ki-84 with updated versions of the Ha-45 engine. The most advanced variants of this power plant even received a cutting-edge direct fuel injection system. This was supposed to address those ongoing technical issues. But then a completely different and much more pressing threat emerged. Nakajima's main aircraft engine plant in the city of Musashi caught the undivided attention of bombers from the United States 20th Air Force. Regular raids by American bombers forced the Japanese to scramble to save their production lines. To keep engines flowing, manufacturing of the Ha-45 had to be partially moved to a secured underground factory in Asakawa. At the same time, a new facility was hastily opened in the city of Hamamatsu. During its production run, this fighter was rolled out at a truly impressive pace. In less than a year and a half, 2 Nakajima plants and a facility in Harbin built over 3,400 examples of the Ki-84. Throughout this whole period, the basic airframe stayed pretty much the same. But the aircraft was continually tweaked and improved. The early production models quickly gave way to an updated version. Here, the standard machine guns were swapped out for 2 Ho-5 cannons. Thanks to this upgrade, the fighter packed a formidable battery of 4 cannons right out of the gate. Later on, a special variant was developed, a rare one, built specifically to take on the massive American B-29 bombers. It was armed with 2 synchronized 20mm Ho-5 cannons. It also carried 2 hard-hitting 30mm Ho-105 wing cannons. In early 1945, Nakajima introduced another interesting variant. This one featured modified wings and a wooden tail section. All the woodworking was done in total secrecy at a nondescript factory in the city of Tanuma. Most of these airframes were fitted with Ha-4521 engines pushing out 1,990 horsepower. Meanwhile, some got the upgraded Ha-4525 engine with a similar output. The very last production aircraft, however, were equipped with an even more advanced power plant. They used a 2,000 horsepower Ha-4523 engine featuring direct fuel injection. The top speed of these modernized fighters reached an impressive 416 miles per hour. The manufacturing company itself called them the Ki-84 Hayate, roughly the improved Gale. However, the Japanese Aviation General Staff and the Ministry of Munitions never actually approved this name. Because of this, the military continued using the old basic designations. Nakajima engineers also developed a design for a 2-seat trainer aircraft with dual controls. However, it never actually made it to full-scale production. The military found a workaround, though. A few standard Ki-84 fighters were modified by mechanics right in the field. They stripped out the radio gear and the heavy armored backrest. This freed up space for a second seat behind the pilot. And even though they did not have true dual controls, these improvised aircraft were perfect for taking green pilots up for familiarization flights. This gave them a feel for how the fighter handled in the air. There was also a dedicated high-altitude interceptor in the works. This version used the standard Ki-84 airframe, but it was modified to take an Ha-45 Ru engine, complete with a turbocharger fitted in the lower fuselage. Unfortunately for the design team, World War II came to an end. This happened before they could finally see this ambitious project through to completion. After the heavy fighting in the Philippines, the new Ki-84s quickly began replacing the aging Ki-43 and Ki-44 models across 11 air regiments. Around the same time, 2 brand new squadrons entered the fray. They were completely outfitted with these modern aircraft. The Hayate fighters proved incredibly effective and versatile. They were used with great success for deep penetration raids behind enemy lines, fighter sweeps, and ground attacks. They also excelled at interception and even dive bombing. They quickly became a genuine nightmare for Allied pilots. At the same time, they earned high praise from Japanese aviators. A small number of these aircraft were sent to operate in Burma, China, and the East Indies. But they truly made their mark in massive numbers and with aggressive tactics in the skies over Okinawa. There, the Ki-84s achieved impressive results. They pulled off highly successful day and night fighter sweeps directly over American airfields. Looking inside the Hayate cockpit, the overall layout was very well thought out. It fully met the strict quality standards of the time. The pilot had solid protection. This was provided by an armored headrest, a sturdy armor plate behind the seat, and a thick, bulletproof windscreen. However, the aircraft had a few serious drawbacks. It completely lacked an emergency canopy jettison system. It also did not carry any fire suppression equipment whatsoever. Because of this, any serious mid-air fire could turn this advanced fighter into a death trap. On the ground, the aircraft was somewhat unwieldy. Steering it while taxiing was fairly tricky due to the quirky way the braking system operated. But the takeoff itself was a pleasant experience. The takeoff roll was relatively short. Engine torque was barely noticeable as long as the pilot applied the throttle smoothly. However, if you jammed the throttle forward, the fighter would yaw hard. This forced you to tap the brakes and apply full left rudder just to keep it tracking straight. The fighter would lift off at 95 miles per hour. It boasted an absolutely fantastic climb rate. It reached 10,000 feet in just 2.5 minutes. Overall, the aircraft was less maneuverable than some of the earlier Japanese Army Air Force fighters. Despite this, it still easily outperformed many Allied fighters of the era. The aircraft responded crisply to the controls. Both the ailerons and rudder were light to the touch. However, at 300 miles per hour, the rudder actually became a bit too sensitive. The elevators, on the other hand, required heavier stick pressure. Still, it did not cause any real discomfort for the pilots. One thing pilots noticed right away: the only trim tab you could adjust in flight was on the elevator. A lot of pilots pointed out that if they had included a rudder trim tab as well, the aircraft would have been a much more stable gun platform. When it came to stalling and spinning, the Hayate behaved quite predictably. The aircraft gave the pilot clear, early buffeting to warn that it was approaching a stall. Because of this, you could always avoid trouble by easing off the stick in time. On approach, the Hayate was just as well behaved. Pilots would drop the gear once their airspeed dipped below 158 miles per hour. After fully extending the flaps, the speed would bleed off to 130 miles per hour. The fighter touched down at 92 miles per hour. The landing roll was pretty short. However, once the tail dropped and the aircraft settled into a 3-point stance, forward visibility from the cockpit became downright awful. This fighter was highly regarded by its pilots. They especially praised its excellent flight stability. This made the aircraft an ideal platform for night combat missions. Allied pilots who flew captured examples were equally impressed. For instance, a test pilot from the United States Army Air Forces at Wright Field concluded his flight evaluation with these words: "I consider the Ki-84 Frank to be a fighter that combines excellent maneuverability, superb handling, and a highly competitive climb rate for its class." The way the aircraft responds to stick input so effortlessly and naturally is simply amazing. At the same time, the light pilot armor and fairly short combat radius leave a lot to be desired. This is especially true if you are judging this airplane by late war American standards. As the war closed in on the Japanese home islands, Nakajima engineers pushed hard on a major upgrade of the base Ki-84 airframe. Their main goal was to turn it into an effective high-altitude interceptor with better overall flight performance. And they were doing all of this while facing a severe shortage of raw materials. Because of this, they tried adapting the aircraft to be built from non-strategic materials that were still available domestically. Here is where each of those projects stood by the end of the war. The Ki-84N. This was an ambitious high-altitude interceptor project. The plan was to equip it with a massive 18-cylinder Nakajima Ki-84 radial engine. It was pushing out 2,500 horsepower. Wing area was increased from about 21 to just over 22 square meters. This allowed for better handling at high altitudes. At the time of Japan's surrender, this aircraft was still on the drawing board, but military leadership had already planned to mass produce it under the new designation Ki-117. The Ki-84P. By the end of the fighting, this project was also stuck in the early design phase. The plan here was to use that same 2,500 horsepower Nakajima Ki-84 engine. However, they made the wing even larger. They increased its area by another 3.5 square meters, bringing the total to around 24 square meters. The Ki-84R. This variant was less of a gamble and easier to pull off. They used the standard airframe as a base. they adapted it for the 2,000 horsepower Nakajima Ha-4544 engine. The centerpiece of this power plant was a two-stage, three-speed supercharger. When Japan finally surrendered, the first flying prototype of this fighter was nearly 80% complete. The Ki-113, this version was drawn up back in the fall of 1944. Due to chronic aluminum shortages, they decided to build the Ki-113 partially out of steel. Carbon steel was used for the cockpit section and inner wing ribs. Meanwhile, the skin was made of sheet steel. By early 1945, engineers managed to put together a prototype. It was powered by a 1,990 horsepower Ha-4521 engine. They even armed it with 4 20mm cannons. But this steel bird never took to the skies. Because of the material substitution, it ended up disastrously overweight. It simply would not have been airworthy. The story behind the Ki-116 began after engineers successfully adapted the Kawasaki Ki-61 fighter to take a Mitsubishi Ha-112 radial engine. Inspired by this success, the Japanese Army Air Force Command tasked the Manchu Company with modifying 4 more of these airframes. They decided to install a powerful 1,500 horsepower Ha-33 engine. It was paired with a 3-blade propeller from the Ki-46. This conversion turned out to be surprisingly successful. The design team managed to shave a massive 1,000 pounds off the aircraft's weight. When the war ended, this promising fighter was right in the middle of intense flight testing. The Ki-117 is also worth a second mention. This was the official designation the Japanese planned to give the future production version of the high-altitude Ki-84 Hayate. At that time, it was still only in the design phase. Meanwhile, the design bureaus were buzzing with work on new developments. However, Japanese military aviation was going through some of its darkest days. Due to a crippling shortage of aviation fuel, the High Command was forced to drastically cut back on combat sorties. Most aircraft were grounded and held in reserve. They were preparing to repel the anticipated Allied invasion of the Japanese home islands. Still, a few squadrons put up a fierce fight. These were specifically the squadrons based in Narumatsu, Tokorozawa, Omachi, and Taisho. Flying Hayate fighters, they desperately tried to hold off the aircraft of the United States 20th Air Force. They also fought against carrier-based planes from the United States 3rd Fleet and the British Pacific Fleet. Ultimately, the odds were heavily stacked against the Japanese. They were completely outnumbered. The subsequent atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki only accelerated the Empire's inevitable defeat. Interestingly enough, one surviving Ki-84 that fell into American hands at the end of the war and was put through its paces stateside actually got a second life. In 1963, it was completely restored by the team at Garrett A. Research at Los Angeles International Airport. The historic aircraft took to the skies once again on June 25, 1963. At the controls that day was Walker Bud Mahurin. He was a legendary American pilot, a United States Air Force Reserve colonel, and a fighter ace in both World War II and the Korean War. This unique aircraft has been carefully preserved to this day. Currently, experts at the Aviation Museum in Ontario, California, continue to maintain it in pristine flying condition. This gives everyone a chance to see a piece of living history in the air.